Very quick background on me for those of you who I haven't met. Meg Fitzgerald, I'm part of Insight's Marketing Center of Excellence and have an operating background in B2B marketing and sales. I love all things data, and therefore I'm super excited for the next hour. Chances are, if you're tuned in today, you have at least heard of intent data and are interested in learning more about how it could benefit your funnel, or potentially you're already leveraging intent and you want to understand how you could drive more from it. Intent is kind of the talk of the town here at Insight, and when we work with our portfolio companies, it's often top of mind, especially when it comes to all things account-based. And so with that, today we are very lucky, and it's a pleasure to be joined by Mike Burton, co-founder of Bombora, which is a premier intent data solution that Insight has recently formed a strategic partnership with. Mike is going to speak with us a bit more about that, why intent matters, and he will walk us through 3 tactical use cases that you should be able to put to work ASAP to power your intent strategy. So with that, thanks so much for being here today, Mike. I'm going to pass the baton over to you to let you introduce yourself and Bombora.
Great. Thanks so much, Meg. It's really exciting to be here and to speak to everybody about intent data, something near and dear to my heart. Of course, I've been working here at Bombora for about 6 or 7 years on building an intent data offering, and we've learned quite a lot about how marketers and sales organizations can best adopt it. So we're really excited to share some of that with you today. And Meg promised me earlier that if I start rambling or if I get off topic, she can jump in and pull me back on track and ask me some questions. So feel free to jump back in, Meg.
Absolutely, will do.
Thank you. Thank you. So yeah, I think even before we get into intent data at all, good to kind of level set around B2B buying and how that's changed over the last several years. And these stats have been around for the last couple of few years, so you've all probably seen them in some form or another. But the first one's the biggest. It's the biggest shift and the most important thing. It's really what has made intent data more and more important over the last few years. And that's that, B2B buyers are doing their own research before often they're engaging with a vendor. And even in an emerging, more immature market like intent data, we already see this. We're already talking to customers all the time that have already done a lot of homework on the intent data space and Bombora, which is surprising. You'd think in a new emerging space that vendors would be relied on, but even in our world, we see companies doing lots and lots of research before they engage with us. So that means in a more mature market, more competitive market, that's even more the case. If you're selling in a very established market, a mature market, companies are doing a lot of research before they're engaging with a salesperson. And this is a big shift. So in the past, a salesperson had more of an opportunity to be a strategic advisor and shape a buyer's journey. And not to say that that's gone away completely or that's impossible, but it's more rare and it's a little bit more elusive for a salesperson. The other thing is, B2B buying's become a group activity. There's more stakeholders involved in these decisions. So just this kind of purely lead-based world, or the understanding of the behavior of an individual, becomes a little less valuable. The understanding of the aggregate behavior of a business becomes more valuable kind of in this world. And then, okay, so these bigger buying groups and this research journey that's happening before buyers talk to vendors, not surprisingly, that's taking place on the internet. Largely. There's other ways that this research takes place. People talk to peers, they talk to former colleagues, they go to trade shows. So some of this happens offline, but according to Forrester, more than half of it takes place on the internet. It's a very popular place to do research, so that shouldn't be surprising. So with all of that context, this is where intent data becomes important. Intent data is designed, and the promise of it is very simple. It's to tell you which businesses are researching your products and services. So while these buyers are in the first 60% of their buying phase, and they might not be talking to you, they might not be giving you signals that they are in a research phase for your products and services, intent data attempts to the best of its ability to tap into that part of the world and surface that information for both sales and marketing organizations, so that they can jump into the buyer's journey, they can become strategic advisors, and they can have a voice in the buyer's journey. So that's all kind of context on the buying process and how it's changed and how intent data can become important. And then we start to talk about the adoption of intent data and how it can be used. And it's very much, we believe anyway strongly that it's a crawl, walk, run proposition. In full bloom, it can be used across an entire go-to-market motion, right? So starting from the right-hand side, where we talk about the most complex use cases, would be, the biggest companies in the world that have data science and analytics teams. And they're building their own propensity models where intent data is a very important ingredient. In marketing automation, this is the idea of building lead acceleration flows, largely for an inbound sales organization. And this one, while it's a little more complex, we're going to talk a little bit about later, because I think it's important for anyone who has more of an inbound muscle from a sales perspective. So things like customer success, right? Using intent data to identify churn risk, cross-sell, upsell opportunities. Content marketing is an interesting one that's looking at macro intent data trends across your markets so that you can create content that joins conversations that are already happening, as opposed to kind of creating content in your own vacuum and kind of getting buyers to join your conversation. And there's a bunch of others, prioritizing contacts that you've captured at events, measuring your pipeline for reliability using intent data and intent signals. And all of these things are supremely possible. They're extremely achievable. They're just maybe not the first things that we would recommend you start doing. I think the goal for today is to walk through a few use cases that if you really wanted to, you could stand up in a day. And as we do that, we'll kind of tip our cap to what they would look like at scale. But we do see, we believe in this idea of just starting really small and simple with intent data. We have a customer that we work with closely, and the way he described his intent data journey was, you can't optimize until you start. And I think that's a great mantra when it comes to intent data, because it's easy to get tripped up on what the perfect deployment looks like, but there's a lot of green field and open space to just get quick wins and gain excitement and alignment. And then all of the work and the effort that it takes to deploy intent data at scale becomes much more easy to justify across an organization. So we believe in starting small, and we're going to walk through some ways to start small today. So the first one we'll walk through is this idea of outbound sales prioritization. This is typically in the realm of an SDR or a BDR motion. It might be an inside sales motion if you've got a lower cost product and you've got an inside sales team that are bringing transactions all the way to contract. But the kind of common denominator in this suggested use case is that you've got a higher volume sales motion and it's outbound in nature. Like I said earlier, we'll talk a little bit about one that is inbound in nature, but for this use case, we're focused on a higher volume sales context where there's an appetite for prioritization, right? So a picture, I'm an SDR and I come in and God bless my soul, I've got 500 accounts in my name and it's Monday morning. We're talking about using this data to say, hey, who are the out of my 500, who are the 50 or the 100 that are most likely to engage with me this week based on intent data? This is a use case that we really, really encourage folks to start with for a bunch of reasons. One is it's pretty close to revenue. It's pretty close to opportunity creation. It's pretty close to net new engagement, right? So if you can start and get a win on that level, it drives a lot of alignment and it drives a lot of excitement. Not that getting a better click-through rate on an ad campaign or getting a better response from a lead generation campaign isn't exciting. It is. But if you can start here with a sales side win, it makes deploying intent data at larger scale much, much simpler and easy to align around. So what we're actually saying here is to start with spreadsheets. And that's okay. Spreadsheets are okay. They're not a load-bearing structure. They shouldn't be thought of for much more than a month. But they're a great way to get started, especially in this simple outbound sales prioritization use case where there's a need for prioritization. So a couple kind of practical tips in this use case. One would be start with a target account list. Intent data providers can certainly say, hey, we can help you find accounts that aren't on your list, that might be showing intent, that should be on your list, that you should be talking to. And they're right. And that's a great thing to explore. But when you're getting started, start with the accounts that you already know you care about, right? And this way, there's a much higher likelihood of success and alignment in the long run, right? The white space approach can be great, but if you get an account with lots and lots of intent, but it doesn't look like an account in your ICP, it can be a little bit of a letdown. So start with the accounts you know you care about. And on the far right-hand side, what we're implying is like, pull out the accounts that are in your pipeline, right? So let's like talk with your ICP, your key account list, but focus on accounts that you're not engaged with yet, right? Because now whatever wins that we can drive during this test, it's a net new win, right? If we include accounts in your pipeline and you catching more engagement from an account you were already engaged with, there's a little bit of a, well, that was cool, I'm glad that happened, but we were already talking to that company. If you just start with a list of companies that you're not engaged with at all, there's almost guaranteed to be a high five if we can create more meetings and more engagement from those companies, right? It's all net new engagement, which is a good place to start.
Just interjecting super quick, Mike,
Sure.
for folks that don't know, ICP stands for Ideal Customer Profile. I just wanted to make sure everyone was aware of that. Keep going.
Cool. No, thank you, Meg. Thank you. I appreciate that. And yeah, I think maybe even in a step back, intent data is best for folks that have identified their target list of accounts. And they have identified, and they have that baked into an actual list of companies. That's not like a total prerequisite. I think there's gains to be made without it, but intent data is designed to be an optimization of kind of an account-based approach. I don't say account-based marketing, I say an account-based approach. So yeah, if that makes sense.
We actually call it ABX internally at Insight, which is it's not sales, it's not marketing, it's X, it's everything. And we have a couple portfolio companies that use the acronym ABE, account-based everything.
Nice.
So yeah, and I think intent is perfectly aligned to optimize any account-based strategy.
Great. And yeah, I think just on this use case from kind of a spirit standpoint, what we like to advise folks is, don't overpromise. There's these in this SDR, BDR, inside sales use case, these people are coming in and making these calls and dropping in these email cadences and hunting on LinkedIn anyway. They're going to be doing that work regardless. All we're suggesting is that we can create significant lift by targeting this particular list of accounts this week. And when we're selling this internally, we would advise, it's like, hey, let's give this a shot. Let's see if these companies are more engaged. I think where people sometimes can get tripped up is if they overpromise and say, good news, everybody, we have a new data source and all of these companies are in market, right? And this is going to be the best week we've ever had here. These companies are going to be ready to pull out their checkbooks and sign with us immediately. Hopefully we're going to catch a few of those, right? But I'd rather do that after under promising and over delivering rather than to kind of tell everybody that we have something that's completely magic. So those are just kind of three very tactical pieces of advice as you stand up this use case. And we'll talk about it a little bit more later, but say it works, right? And say you've got 10 SDRs and on the week or two that you've tested the intent data, let's say you've generated 40% more meetings. Let's say one or two of those meetings is moving really fast and seems to have a higher propensity to close quickly, and the test is deemed a huge success. The next thing you'll want to do is figure out, okay, hey, where should this data live for ongoing automated workflow, right? Is it live in Salesforce so that we can automatically generate tasks when companies have a certain degree of intent? Should it live in marketing automation so that we could score through MQLs based on intent? So that's kind of a longer exploration, but needless to say that the idea would be once you've proven it worked, think about how you can scale it and automate it week over week. So like I said, we think that's kind of use case one. If you're to kind of like tie off on that one a little bit, if you're saying to yourself, well, hey, my inside salespeople and my SDRs and my BDRs, they really only call on inbound leads. They're not really doing a lot of that outbound hunting. This is a great opportunity to put intent data inside of marketing automation. So we probably won't go into a ton of detail on that today, but the opportunity in that inbound context would be to say, okay, normally if a user just does one thing within the last 30 days in my marketing automation system, I'm not going to score that through for my inside sales team. However, if they've just done that one thing in the last 30 days and they work at a company that's showing tremendous surge activity or intent, then you could use that as a new segmentation lever and push that contact through as an MQL, even though in the normal, without that data, it wouldn't have qualified. So this is a tremendous way to kind of uncover MQLs or SQLs, depending on your nomenclature, that you actually already have. They weren't revealed to you through first-party behavior. So it's just slightly more complex to stand up because you have to really start with an integration. It's a little bit more difficult to just kind of get started with spreadsheets. But needless to say, if you're inbound oriented, the same benefits are kind of waiting for you, if that's helpful. So we want to move into a second use case that we also think if you wanted to stand up tomorrow, you could. And the reason why we're going to focus on LinkedIn in particular is because it doesn't require the adoption of any other ad platform. Like ABM advertising, you kind of need a way to do ABM advertising. You need to have adopted an ABM platform, or you need to have worked with an ad agency that helps you execute media campaigns. There's another hop or another step involved. Now, applying intent data to those use cases is simple. But it might not apply to everybody. Not everybody may have, adopted a tool like Triblio or Terminus or Rollworks or another ABM platform. So here we're suggesting a great way to start and see the value of intent data is through LinkedIn, right? Because with LinkedIn, you can upload a list of companies and create what they call a matched audience, and then deploy sponsored updates or in-mail campaigns against that list of companies. And really simply, if you have LinkedIn benchmarks or you want to create a control group, really, really simply see the lift of using intent data. So tactically speaking, if you had a list of companies, and I would use the same criteria that we used in the outbound sales prioritization, where companies that are on your target account list or in your ideal customer profile, maybe ones that you're not talking to right now. So this, any wins would create net new engagement with these companies. You could upload that list of companies that have intent to the LinkedIn platform. Once that audience lives on LinkedIn, you can layer in other attributes on the LinkedIn side, right? The important stuff like job title, seniority, other attributes about the persona that you want to reach from these high intent companies. And then this becomes an audience that can be targeted with sponsored updates or in-mail. And like I was kind of alluding to earlier, it could be tested against a control group, or you might already have really good baselines on what your normal click-through rate and your normal cost per lead is for a LinkedIn campaign. Another way to measure it, and this depends on kind of your nurture flow, but consider following the power of those leads that come from the surging companies on your LinkedIn campaign. If every lead that you get from a LinkedIn program is getting a sales touch, well, now you can measure one step downstream, and you can say, okay, when we did sales follow-up on these leads, how much did those convert to opportunities and meetings when compared to a normal LinkedIn campaign? And if you're not necessarily touching every lead, if you're putting them into nurture, you can still find a way to measure their speed through the nurture flow and how many of those leads did ultimately become MQL or SQL after the LinkedIn program. And much like the sales prioritization, there's a few ways to scale this and automate it once you've proven it works. So one is if the intent data ultimately lives in your marketing automation platform. Platforms like Marketo in particular, they can connect a list of contacts from Marketo into a LinkedIn campaign, and that can be an always-on flow. So you could write a rule in Marketo that says, hey, if I have any contacts that work at companies that are surging on a certain number of topics or have a certain level of intent, to keep it generic, those contacts can float through to LinkedIn as a campaign. And as that audience changes week over week, that can be an evergreen high intent campaign onto LinkedIn. And that's an automated flow that you can set and forget. There's other integrations that involve, Bombora has one of them, there's others. that allow you to connect a company level audience to LinkedIn in an always on kind of dynamic evergreen model. The latter has a little more scale. So if you're not just sending known contacts to LinkedIn, you're actually sending a list of domains, you'll get more scale. But either one of those, either using a domain-based integration into LinkedIn or your marketing automation connectors to LinkedIn, take this high intent audience strategy and automate it, which, of course, is important for use over time. Cool. So there's one other really, really simple one that we wanted to run through. And this one's, maybe not in a bad way, but maybe even harder to automate over time. This is a bit more of a powerful ad hoc use case. So let's say you have a webinar coming up, or you've just gotten a really powerful new piece of thought leadership or content. You have something that you want to promote, and you want to go beyond just the contacts that you've already captured. This can be challenging, right? Because it's hard to just buy a big list of contacts from a big list of companies and do a really mass email out to those contacts. But with intent data, you can be much, much more targeted. So let's use the webinar example. You've got a big webinar coming up on topic XYZ. You can start with companies from your account list or companies from your ideal customer profile that are showing high intent on topic XYZ. And you can go to whatever contact provider you rely on. A lot of these contact providers already have integrations to the intent data that you may have access to. But even if they don't, it's a simple list pull. And you say, hey, contact provider, here's a big list of 100 companies that we'd like contacts from. And with those contacts, you can run a much, much more targeted promotion of that webinar or that piece of content. And much like the LinkedIn use case, downstream, we can measure the power of those leads, right? So on the front end, we can measure things like email click-through rate and open rate. But then based on those that did register for the webinar or register for the piece of content, what was the downstream sales follow-up lift as well? So it's similar to the LinkedIn use case. It's a little more ad hoc, but these are still big parts of a marketer's demand gen strategy in a lot of cases is content promotion and net new contact acquisition. So I'm trusting Meg to jump in if I'm missing anything so far. Hopefully this is making sense.
No, this is great, Mike. I would say that these are three incredibly relevant use cases. I think additionally, just to kickstart and really strengthen your account-based go-to-market broadly, intent is a big trigger, a big lever in that. Also, strategic nurture programs. Re-engagement of accounts that have shown a renewed interest in learning more. You can actually segment nurture streams leveraging intent data. We've also seen companies use it in field marketing, so actually identifying specific geos where there's surging interest and then planning field marketing or sales acceleration events in those areas. Loads of ways. I think these three use cases are, as Mike stated in the beginning, really tactical. You could get started tomorrow. So I'll let you continue. Yeah. I don't know if you've seen Bombora used in any other use cases that you think might be relevant for the audience.
Yeah, all of those that you mentioned are relevant. And the reason why we wanted to focus on these three today is this idea that, it's hard to get to some of those until there's this organizational alignment around the data source.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. So we start with sales. It's like, hey, we got into 3 brand new opportunities this week that we would not have gotten into without this data. Once that happens, there's this psychological shift, and like standing up these other use cases like events and field marketing and using it for customer success, all of the barriers to those things go down. And it really does creates amazing alignment between sales and marketing. We joke around sometimes that if you listen to a presentation on ABM, you'll almost definitely hear someone say, well, first, sales and marketing need to align. And we consider that a generic statement because you need something to align around. Align around what? So that can be as simple as we all agree on this list of accounts, and that's powerful. But there's a next level to that. We agree on these accounts, and then we agree on this particular strategy of attacking these accounts systematically. And we think that's where intent data can be the really exciting key that creates kind of a common language between sales and marketing and a lot of the use cases you just mentioned, Meg.
Absolutely. I think that these three specifically kind of rally the full go-to-market around some early use cases. And then you can even get into, well, how do I leverage intent to predict churn, customer success, as you mentioned, and further down the funnel into expansion opportunities as well. So great.
Yeah, that's right. And you mentioned, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, and just a quick plug to everyone on the line. Make sure that you're typing your questions in the side panel as we go.
Yeah, I think Meg, you touched on some really powerful use cases that were kind of triggered with integrating this data into marketing automation. And just broadly speaking, the way those integrations work is, and say like, sure, Marketo, for example, and the other systems as well, but Marketo, for example, is largely like the classic version is a lead-based platform. But leads work for companies, and companies are monitored for this intent data. So typically speaking, intent data can be appended down to a contact record, even though intent data is a company level proposition. But a lot of the great use cases that Meg mentioned can be triggered once that data is loaded into marketing automation. So she kind of mentioned a wake the dead type proposition, which is a really powerful use case, right? Everybody spent a lot of money building these databases. And if we're all being honest with each other, 90% of them are usually dormant. Sometimes if you're really good at keeping them engaged, maybe 60 or 70% are dormant, but the majority are not responding right now. But of like that big list of dormant names that you paid for in some way to acquire, whether it was hard cost or soft cost, there was a cost to acquiring those names. Some of them work at companies that are surging on topics related to your offerings. And we've seen a lot of success in running targeted nurtures at the company, at those contacts, based on what their company's surging on. So it's a great way to continue to revive the investment you've already made with marketing automation. Another one through marketing automation that we touched on earlier, I think is important to reiterate, is how we feed this data and impact an inbound oriented sales team, right? So this is a lot of the universe, a lot of the customers we work with, like, hey, we don't do that outbound hunting. We really rely on marketing to drive hand raisers, and we have a team of people that qualify those hand raisers. And there, to use intent data in that use case, it's hard to do it without marketing automation. You might be able to load the data into CRM like Salesforce and then push it into marketing automation, but ultimately it needs to be scored in marketing automation to drive that lead acceleration use case, which is really important in an inbound context. Of course, Salesforce can become a really, really powerful place to load the data. It can be portable from Salesforce to sales engagement platforms like Outreach and SalesLoft. It can more elegantly be pushed into ABM platforms like Triblio, Terminus, Rollworks, etc. So Salesforce is a powerful hub as well. Typically speaking, just to kind of size the lift, most customers don't have to implement it in both marketing automation and CRM. Usually there's an elegant way to get it everywhere it needs to be by choosing just the one system of record to integrate the data into. So I know we have just probably 8 or 9 minutes here before we want to make sure we have time to take some questions. Just wanted to orient quickly on Bombora a little bit and how our approach to collecting intent data, and then definitely want to get to your questions if you have any. We'd love to dive into the interactive portion. But broadly speaking, we think this is important context. So the core of the Bombora approach to intent data is a large cooperative of thousands and thousands of B2B research sites. So starting about 5 years ago, we actually went out and started building one-to-one relationships with most of the biggest B2B media companies in the world. So some of those are big premium business websites like Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg, Business Insider, Forbes. And then all of kind of the research publications and trade publications. So, 1105 Media, Haymarket Media, Source Media, Quinn Street Enterprise, CBS Interactive, a load of others who have joined this cooperative and allow Bombora to listen to companies consuming these B2B research topics across this large ecosystem. So this is kind of the raw material that Bombora has access to that allows us to monitor companies and their consumption of these B2B research topics. What's been good is over time, those constituents have grown. We've added, a lot of lead generation providers into the co-op, so we can see things like white paper downloads and webinar signups, very rich behavioral interactions. We even have many, many marketers that have joined the co-op, right? They get information on who comes back to their websites, and they place the Bombora tag technology so that their inventory also becomes visible to our cooperative. And the common denominators, all of these constituents get value back in return. The publishers get the data for ad targeting and campaign analytics and lead scoring and email segmentation. Marketers get who's coming to their website. Everybody who joins gets value back. It's kind of an everybody wins strategy. And in return, Bombora gets to monitor companies consuming research and ultimately create our product, Company Surge Analytics, which is kind of our productization of intent data that we make available to the market. And historically, this is a bit of a shift for us, and we're excited to be talking to you all today about this particular evolution of our business. Historically, we've sold this data directly to the biggest technology companies in the world. And we've done very well at this and become a bit of a standard for these large enterprises in terms of keying their sales and marketing around this data. But we've just recently rolled out our growth segment package, and we've come up with a great way to distill this data and to throttle it to some extent, but in a way that still allows for an extremely powerful kind of amount and scalability of data for a much, much wider part of the B2B sales and marketing ecosystem. So Meg can give a little bit more information about how you can take advantage of this growth segment package, which is detailed here. The special offer that we're making for Insight Venture portfolio businesses is the ability to sign up for this package with a 13-month agreement where the first 30 days are free and you'd have a 30-day out. So effectively, a lot of those really simple use cases that we walked through together, you could work with Bombora to stand them up. Bombora would be on the hook with you to make them successful as a business partner. And if Bombora were to fail at doing that, you wouldn't be on the hook for the data licensing agreement. So we think it's a great way from a packaging standpoint to democratize access to this powerful data, and then with this particular offer to help folks dive in, start to see really early simple value without having to take a big risk from a budget perspective. So I think those are the main things we wanted to run through. I know Meg, you might have a little housekeeping, and hopefully we have a couple of questions as well.
Yeah, we're super excited about this strategic offer for our portfolio companies. Again, make sure to check out Bombora's profile on the Go Network, and feel free to reach out with any questions at all. Few questions. So, Mike, are there any preconditions or readiness capabilities requirements for using intent, Bombora specifically?
Great question. Yeah, I think we touched on one earlier. Is I think you want to have your hands around your ideal customer profile. Like it wouldn't be, if you're still figuring out, who you really want to sell to. I don't think you're probably ready for intent data yet. Like you want to either have a clean account list, a key account list that you've established, or at least a really good idea of the types of companies that you want to go after. I think that would be prerequisite number one. And number two is that you want to have a little scale, right? If you like that SDR use case, well, you should have at least 2 or 3 or 4 SDRs. And if you like those top of funnel use cases, you should probably be spending at least $50,000 to $100,000 a year at the top of the funnel on those use cases, right? Because you don't want to spend $20,000 or $60,000 on intent data to optimize one salesperson and a very small amount of top funnel activity. So it's not to say that it's impossible to use if you're in a really, really small motion, but you're certainly going to get the bigger your machine is, the more value you're going to get out of it. If you have 5 SDRs, you could get amazing value. If you have 30 SDRs, you're going to get even more value, right? Because you have a higher kind of appetite for prioritization. And like if you just zoom it into that LinkedIn use case, if you only spend $10,000 a year on LinkedIn, well, you'd be spending more on the data than you do on the use case. So I think those are the two things: a really good idea of your addressable market, and a little bit of scale in terms of go-to-market motion.
Yeah, I think that makes a whole lot of sense. Alignment as well, right? Which is always what we're preaching: alignment between sales and marketing. Okay, next one is what's the difference between what's broadly known as predictive data and intent?
Yeah, great question. Historically, this kind of predictive category was very, very popular 4 or 5 years ago. And really what it ended up being is a fit model, or the identification of an ICP, an ideal customer profile. And it turned out to be a foundational kind of feature to an account-based approach, right? So it's probably, the word predictive is probably a bad name for what it actually is. It's really a foundational step of understanding who your key accounts should be. So it's really account selection. So companies like Everstring or LeadSpace or Lattice Engines, they're companies that have done well helping folks understand who are their accounts, who are their accounts that they should be going after from an ideal customer profile standpoint. Intent data is typically something that's used to prioritize after you've established that kind of predictive model on who your accounts are, if that made sense.
Yeah, I think that's perfect. Okay, and then this is a perfect segue in. How does Bombora's data differ from other types of intent data and some of the other providers that you see out there?
Yeah, I think you could break it into a couple categories just to kind of give you a framework of how to think about it. There's kind of like a smaller or single source intent data providers. G2 Crowd is a great example. So this is a tremendous, powerful buying intent signal that comes in a smaller volume. It does not make it less valid. It's powerful data, and it's it's a very intuitive form of intent data. It just doesn't come with a lot of scale. It's probably not something that you could fuel an entire go-to-market motion around, right? Like you couldn't feed all your SDRs and feed all your advertising programs based on G2 Crowd data, but it's very powerful. So there's a couple others that fall into that kind of single source category. So think of it as, a powerful intent data that doesn't come with a lot of scale. Bombora lives on kind of like the at scale category. So our proposition is to help fuel a go-to-market motion where you can kind of control the scale and the precision of this signal. So if you have 30 SDRs, you can create an intent signal that'll feed 30 SDRs. And if you have a $500,000 top of funnel budget, you could create an intent signal that feeds that budget. So there's few other providers that live in this kind of at scale world. I think the core difference between us and some of those other providers is that their intent data is an ingredient inside of their software products, right? So it's a bit of a religious difference. Bombora is only a data company. We really just do this one thing. We monitor companies consuming research, and we surface when we see these big research spikes. So hopefully, shedding false modesty, we're the best in the world at just that one thing. Whereas the other intent providers that can offer that same type of scale, they're okay at the intent data piece. They do a lot of other stuff. They have software, they have workflow, they might have advertising platforms, they might have contacts. They're a bit more of like a one-stop shop. So the Bombora is a great solution for, if you want to start with the very best intent data and then kind of plug it in across the stack you have, versus buying intent data as an ingredient in another platform. Hopefully that was helpful just from a framework perspective.
Yeah, I think that's super helpful to give the full picture. Thanks, Mike.
Sure.
Oh, great. Well, I think that is it for questioning, unless anyone else has a last minute question they'd like to squeeze through. Outside of that, thank you so much to everyone who joined us today. Mike, thank you. This has been hugely educational. Again, make sure to check out Bombora's profile on the Go Network. We will send around the recording and the blog, and feel free, as always, to reach out with any questions. And that's
Great.
it.
Thanks, Meg. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks so much, Mike.